to Locally Sourced. I'm Armanda Familetti. The brain is probably the most mysterious organ in the body. What's the difference between your conscious mind and your subconscious? Is your mind and your brain the same? Well, I have a guest tonight that can answer all those questions and more. Welcome, Terence Hines.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Terence, you're a professor of psychology and neurology. What is neuroscience?
Neuroscience is the study of the brain in all its aspects, from the tiniest microstructures and genetics up through the activity of the cortex.
So it covers a huge amount of information.
Exactly. That's what makes it such an interesting and fun area to study.
So what about psychology and neurology? What is the intersection between those two sciences?
Well, more recently, people have created a field called cognitive neuroscience, which is the study of the brain bases of things like perception and language and memory and abnormal behaviors as well.
Okay, what was that again? Cognitive neuroscience.
Cognitive neuroscience.
Would you say you're a cognitive neuroscientist?
I would say I am a cognitive neuroscientist.
So you're looking at how the brain works, affects people, what we would call people's psychology then?
Correct.
Okay.
I mean, I'm studying particular areas of that. Nobody studies the whole thing.
Okay, so you study and you're also a professor. So tell me something about your background and what you do.
I got my undergraduate degree at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, and then went on to a PhD at the University of Oregon in Eugene in Mike Posner's laboratory. And then I spent a year in Boston, which is a lovely little city, working at the Boston Veterans Administration facilities. And I came to New York City to be in Mike Gazzaniga's laboratory for 2 years at Cornell Medical School. And then I came to Pace University in 1981 and have been there ever since. And I'm also an adjunct professor of neurology at New York Medical College in Valhalla, New York.
So what about neuroscience and psychology attracted you to the field?
When I was a little boy, we had a dog, and she had major epileptic seizures. Oh. And I knew that had something to do with the brain, but obviously as a little kid really didn't understand that, and that started my interest, I think, in the brain and behavior, because she had very dramatic seizures.
So that prompted you to find out what's going on in her brain and human brains
Years
as well?
Years later.
Years later, yeah. So you didn't start studying from a child?
Not from fourth grade or whenever it was, no.
Oh, okay.
I really only got interested in what's now called neuroscience in college.
Okay. So we're talking about the brain, and mostly the human brain. What can you tell me quickly, like what's going on in your brain? Just
lots of stuff.
In fact, we have a few slides that we can show people. So here's a slide of a brain, kind of a brain scan, I guess. Tell me what's going on there. Is that what most of our brains look like?
That's a scan of the cut right down the middle of the head. And what you see, I'm not sure what the color codes are, but you see all that infolded kind of ripply material. That's cortex, and that's where higher thought processes take place. And that white structure, that kind of curved white structure in the middle, is called the corpus callosum, and that's the structure that connects the left side of the brain, excuse me, to the right side of the brain, so the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere know what each other is doing. And then below that, in that odd kind of yellowish color, you see what's called the brain stem, and kind of to the right of that, at least from my perspective, that thing that looks like kind of purple cauliflower, that's the cerebellum, and that's involved in movement and balance control. And then further down, where there's that blank space, I'm not sure why there's a blank space there, but in any event, I hope there's not one there in my head, that would be much more kind of automatic, primitive centers that control respiration and heart rate, and information is going down to the muscles to control movement, and sensory information is coming up from the skin and muscles to make us aware of our body.
So I'm really interested in what I would call my conscious mind, my thinking mind. Is there a place on that slide, if we can come back to that slide, where we can see where the thinking brain is as opposed to other brains? Can we go back to the first slide? Thank you. So it's in the front, above the nose?
consciousness is probably distributed throughout the cortical areas, the kind of ripply areas that you see in the middle that are purple in the front on the left, and for reasons that I don't understand, turn yellowish tan in the back. But certainly higher, what we call executive processes, are localized in the frontal areas, above the nose, above and kind of behind the nose. It's those areas that are involved in things like planning ahead, remembering that I had to come here to the show today, remembering that I have a quiz to give on Monday when I go back to class. Moral judgments tend to be made in those frontal areas as well.
So that's where we know what's right and what's wrong.
Correct.
So if I had an injury to that part of my brain, would I lose the ability to know what's right and wrong?
Some people do, and there's some evidence that people who are psychopathic killers, for example, there's a group in the Netherlands that's been putting serial killers in fMRI scanners, and their findings have been that the frontal areas seem to be less active. That's fairly new research, and I must admit I'm not up to date on it.
Okay. Well, I remember a story, this goes back to when I was in school, about an American railroad worker who had a, everyone knows this story,
Phineas Gage,
right?
yes.
Phineas Gage. And that was really a turning point in understanding how the brain works. Could you tell us a little bit about Mr. Gage?
Phineas was a supervisor, a foreman on the Rutland Railroad as it was being built through the Granite Hills of Vermont. And he was in charge of a blasting crew. And the way that that was done back in 1848, very laboriously, you had to drill manually into the rock. And then blasting powder was tamped down into the rock, a fuse was inserted, the fuse was lit, and you ran like hell. Unfortunately, on this day
They don't do that anymore?
No. Unfortunately, on this day in question, Phineas, for whatever reason, instead of using a wooden tamping rod, used a metal tamping rod. Spark, boom. A 6-foot-long tamping rod that he had been using enters here under his left jaw, exits here through his right frontal lobe, and ends up over there. Amazingly, he lived. He had previously been known to be a good worker, a good, sober, honest foreman, loved by his workers. He became less so. He became much more uninhibited. And that was one of the first signs that
he really kind of changed his personality.
It changed his personality, yes.
And that's when they thought an injury to the brain could actually change who a person is.
That's correct. Because until then, most people who had an injury like that just simply died. And it was just by chance that he lived.
Okay, and so did that spark now a whole new...
Well, it supported then more research on frontal lobe function, but that didn't really get going until the late 19th century. I think Phineas got his injury in 1848.
Okay.
But it wasn't until the late 19th century and early 20th century when brain research in its modern sense really took off.
Okay, so let's bring it right up now to the 21st century and the last century. That's really the sort of the golden age of new brain research, would you say?
Certainly in the last 40 years. One of the great advances has been neuroimaging in general. When I was in college, if you wanted to find out what was wrong with somebody in terms of brain injury, often you just had to wait till they died and do the autopsy and see where the damage was.
Right.
By the time I was in graduate school, we had magnetic resonance imaging that shows you tissue density, and therefore you can see tumors and strokes. And more recently, something called functional magnetic resonance imaging, which lets you see in the living person what areas of brain are active when they're doing a particular task.
We have a scan, a slide of a scan actually, if we can see that. And what's interesting about this is a living patient who's in a functional MRI, and you can actually see the parts of their brain that light up for some function. So we don't actually know what's happening here, but can you guess what's happening?
Well, this is a scan just anatomically. At the top are the frontal lobes. And so where those bright red areas on the left are, that's the occipital cortex, that's the visual cortex. So I would assume that in these sorts of scans, the brighter the color, the more active that brain area is. So this person was doing some sort of visual task, but other than that I can't tell. But that gives you an idea of the kind of imagery that we get out of functional imaging. That you ask people to do a particular task and you can watch in real time as the brain changes in response to that task.
Wow. And so what else can you learn from functional MRIs? Can you see if someone has Alzheimer's or brain damage?
Well, yes, you can.
Because that used to be something you had to wait till people died, right?
You still do, but you can get some idea of what's going on. There's good evidence that people who are going to get Alzheimer's disease but don't have any symptoms yet show less brain activity in certain areas than people who will not go on to get Alzheimer's disease.
Oh, really? Wow.
And that's tied probably to a genetic difference. There's a genetic predisposition to Alzheimer's disease, or I should say risk factor, a genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's.
Well, we actually did a show about Alzheimer's a while ago, and there was, I think what they said at the time was that there's no cure for Alzheimer's. So does it make sense to know if you're going to get it or not, or should you prepare for it?
There's no cure, but similarly there's no cure for Parkinson's disease, but there are medications for Parkinson's disease that had years and years of useful life. Unfortunately, at this point, there's no such medications for Alzheimer's. Yeah. The Alzheimer's medications do probably delay the disease by 6 months, maybe a year, which is better than nothing. So it is clinically useful to know, but the magic bullet that's going to make that go away, I doubt if it'll be available in my lifetime, but probably fairly shortly thereafter.
Okay, that's good. I hope you... I won't say anything about that.
Moving right along.
Moving right along. So it's a great diagnostic tool then, and it's also a great way to understand the brain better. So
Right.
Since we've had functional MRIs, have there been any new discoveries that people didn't realize, or that they realized they may have been wrong about what they thought in the past?
Well, I mean, almost everything that's come out of the fMRI literature has been new. Because it's the difference that people think of it this way. fMRI is kind of the equivalent of the microscope in biology. Before the microscope, you could look at stuff and you maybe had a magnifying glass.
That's big.
But with the microscope, things changed. Almost everything people saw under the microscope was new and pretty much unexpected. And in many respects, that's been true of functional neuroimaging as well. Everything is was new and unexpected.
Okay, so let me ask you another question. We have a slide that I thought was of a neuron, but you told me before the show that it's actually just
It's an artist's conception. It's a very good one, but it's an artist's conception.
Okay, why don't we have pictures of neurons?
Well, we do, but they're not that pretty.
Oh, they're kind of dull looking.
Yeah, they can, and they don't show the activity. I mean, in that image, you see the action potentials, the electrical activity represented as those orange flashes. You don't see that in real life.
Oh, you don't?
No. All you see, I mean, even if you could...
See, I thought that's what we saw in the other, in the fMRI.
fMRI, no. This is microscopic. Those neurons are tiny, tiny cells. So what you're seeing in the fMRI is basically blood flow. Areas of brain that are more active require more blood, just like muscles that are more active require more blood.
We're not seeing the sparks.
No, we're not seeing the sparks. That image shows, very artistically, the sparks, which are just electrical potentials traveling on the right side down a dendrite, as it's called, getting to the cell body, that kind of outer space monster-looking thing there. And the circular thing in the middle is the nucleus of the cell, the blue thing. And then if enough action potentials arrive at the cell body, then another action potential is generated and the information flows further on down. But that's electrical. That's just a metaphor, the artist metaphor.
Okay, of what's really happening.
Yeah.
So electricity tends to make a sound. Are there sounds happening in your brain when these synapses are popping? No, it's quiet up there.
The electrical activity is only along the axon and the dendrite. When you transmit information between neurons, that's a chemical process. And those chemicals are called neurotransmitters.
Right. Oh, I see. So there's no pop.
No. It'd be very disconcerting.
Well, you're just spoiling all of the things I thought was going on in my head. Thanks a lot. But I bow to you. You're the expert. So there are chemicals in your brain, right? There are all sorts of things happening in your brain that maybe affect how you think. right?
But everything we think and do and feel and experience is basically is due to chemical reactions.
Right. So if you've got too much of one chemical and not enough of another, how would that affect
Depends on the chemicals. For example, in endogenous depression, there's too little of a chemical called serotonin at certain synapses. Synapses are the connections between neurons at certain synapses, and many of the antidepressive medications increase the level of that drug that chemical called serotonin at those synapses.
And then people aren't as depressed as they
Correct.
were.
Correct.
Okay. But sometimes we get depressed because we're sad, because our dog died, or...
That's called reactive depression.
Okay.
And there are chemical changes there as well. But that's usually a natural response to something that's gone wrong in one's life.
And it tends to get easier to bear as time passes. But what was the other kind of depression you said?
Well, there are three kinds. There's reactive depression when you lose a loved one, or when my students do badly on one of my quizzes or tests.
And you feel sad about that?
They feel sad about that.
Oh, they feel sad, right.
And then there's endogenous depression. Endogenous means coming from within. There's no reason. It's not that something rotten has happened in your life. It's a chemical imbalance. And then there's manic depressive psychosis. Bipolar disorder, as it's now called. And that's a completely different kettle of fish with different chemical abnormalities.
Okay, I see. And so a lot of the maybe, and this is where the psychology part of it, the kind of mental illness that we see, it's caused primarily by things happening in the brain that shouldn't be, chemicals
Generally so.
or injuries, or
Generally so, yes.
I've even heard of people having cysts or tumors in their brain that change their behavior.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So
Again, endogenous depression is the example.
Right.
Too little Now, I'm not saying that certain kinds of psychotherapy aren't effective. Certainly for endogenous depression, what's called cognitive behavior therapy can be quite effective, especially in combination with antidepressant drugs.
Because the brain is actually plastic in a way, is this correct? And so if you can it's almost like a muscle. You can strengthen one muscle if one is weak, and circumvent.
Not quite as dramatically as, if I go to the gym and work out, my muscles are going to get stronger. You can. The adult brain is plastic to a certain extent. New neurons are formed, especially in a part of the brain called the hippocampus, excuse me, which is involved in learning and memory.
That's good.
Yes, it is good. But in general, the adult brain is much less renewable, if that's the right phrase, than, say, the cells in the liver or pancreas or heart, even. Blah, 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 blah.
Really, I think what you're saying is fascinating. The blah, blah, maybe not so much, but...
Let me kind of get back on that track. This is going to be edited out, right?
No. We're live. Keep going.
Well, I just wanted to make the point about these claims that are out there that you can train your brain, that especially adults can train. Obviously, you can train the brain, you can learn new tricks.
Right, well, you're saying adults can learn.
Old people like me can learn new tricks.
I can learn.
But the claim is that these brain training programs like Lumosity and all their other spin-offs are sort of magic bullets, and all you have to do is sit there in front of the computer, and all of a sudden you're better. And that's simply bogus. Lumosity has been under the gun by many neuroscientists for making claims that are simply not true. For example...
So let me back up a little, because maybe I don't know what Lumosity is, or our viewers don't. Is that something you pay to...
I'm sorry, you're right. Lumosity is a commercial company that sells brain training programs for your home computer.
Okay.
And I think 2 years ago, maybe more now, they were fined $2 million by the Federal Trade Commission for making false claims that their brain training programs could treat Alzheimer's disease.
Oh, really?
It was disgraceful. It was unethical. It was dishonest, and they should be in jail. But they were just fined $2 million.
Well, $2 million.
Yeah, but it didn't come out of their executives' pockets. It just came out of the company.
Oh, okay.
So they just raised their prices a little bit.
But have they stopped advertising bogus information?
They have stopped the claim that they treat Alzheimer's disease. They still, and their lawyers have weasel-worded very well, they still claim that brain training games improve cognition. And it is true that you get much better at that particular brain training game you're training on. But there's very little evidence that transfers to real life. It's much better to engage in all kinds of intellectual activities, reading, playing sports, going out and gardening. as opposed to sitting, as I said, in front of the computer, just, screen time.
Right. So actually, you just said playing sports. So what is the connection between physical activity and your brain?
Well, physical activity gets blood flowing, blood flow to the brain uses blood, and physical activity uses the brain. Any physical, well, I won't say any, but certainly any sport requires visual motor coordination, and that's a function of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
So it keeps those circuits kind of working. They don't get rusty.
If you do something that really uses a lot of your brain, like I've heard that ping pong is really good for your brain because, like you say, it's getting blood going, and you have to just kind of do all this. It's a strategic game and it's a physical game. Am I right about, or did I get the wrong information?
I don't know about ping pong versus tennis versus squash versus handball.
Are they all kind of at the same plane?
I would expect so. They all involve similar kinds of activity. Mm-hmm. It would seem not to insult any ping pong players out there, but I would guess, going out on a limb here, that ping pong is somewhat less strenuous than tennis. But maybe I'm wrong.
You haven't seen some high-level ping pong players.
I have seen that, but most people.
Oh, most people. Okay.
Yeah.
The basement ping pong player.
Exactly, versus the kind of average tennis player. I suspect the average tennis player burns more calories in an hour of tennis than the basement ping pong player played. But I could be wrong.
Now, isn't your brain actually fat?
Yes. We're all fatheads.
It's like 90% fat and
it's lipids
and
lipids.
Some water and mix it up and you get a brain.
Yeah, exactly.
See, I know a lot about neuroscience. I'm probably impressing you right now with my knowledge. But we don't have too much time left, actually. But I did want to ask you again because I'm so fascinated by what you were calling the automatic brain.
Oh, okay.
And the conscious brain and the thinking brain and how those all fit together. Because I know there's a part of the brain that keeps your heart beating and keeps your lungs breathing, and you don't think about it.
It's just
which
back is very
there.
Good.
Yeah.
You can't bifurcate or trifurcate. These things are continua. So some things, like when we're talking now, we're very conscious and aware of, and we're not paying attention to lots of other stuff that's going on.
Right.
But if
we can filter out.
The brain filters out the unimportant stuff. But if something happens, say something falls over on the set, we're going to shift our attention to that because there's these monitoring systems that are out there kind of, that's not important, that's not important, oh, that's important, that's not important, that's important.
But that's kind of almost, I'm sure all animals
Absolutely.
have that because that saves their lives. Oh, there's a lion in that bush, I better run away.
And there's a particular brain structure that does that in mammals at least. It's called the superior colliculus, and it's involved in shifting our attention if something appears over here that might be important.
What about being in the zone, right? What's going on when you're
There's another part of the
so focused on something that you lose sense of time, space, you're just right there.
Can we get back that image of the brain scan, the one of the middle?
Yeah, sure. The top of the head brain scan?
The one down the middle.
Oh, the first one we showed, the head.
Yeah, the first one.
The head, there it is.
Right. You see the white structure I call the corpus callosum.
That's the one right in the middle.
Correct. And a little in front of that and above it. Right about there where that yellow stuff is.
Okay.
That's a technical term, by the way, yellow
stuff. Yeah, if it's yellow on this, who knows?
Is a part of the brain that becomes very active when we're really, really focused on something. When you're really interested in something, when you're in the zone, as you say, that area becomes very active. It's called the anterior cingulate gyrus.
Wow.
And that's active. And that area is abnormally inactive in people who have ADHD, for example, who have difficulty focusing.
Oh, I see. And so a brain you could give them something to do a functional MRI, and then you could see that what should be all lit up and
isn't.
Exactly.
Or isn't lit up as much.
Okay. That's so interesting.
Yeah. It's fun stuff.
Fascinating. So let's go back. So I want to talk about, just for a second or two, the unconscious brain. And we were talking before the show, and I mentioned that sometimes if I can't solve a problem, I almost think that I've got a back room in my brain, and I say, I'm going to put this on the back burner. I'm just going to come back to this later. I'm going to let my brain figure it out on its own, not bother me, and then come later with the answer. And you said that is sort of how it works,
That's
right?
sort of how it works. There's a lot of what we call automatic processing going on. The brain is always kind of forming expectations about what's next, and processing the information that you've taken in during the day and so forth. So you don't have to think about it all the time.
So it's almost like somebody's thinking for you.
Well, yeah, a lot of the automatic
And then
stuff
it shoots it
the
to
the back office.
The back office shoots it to the front, and it
Exactly.
says, "Try this when you're in the shower."
And
Or-
sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. But
Okay, so actually, we're running out of time. So, what would you say? What would you want people to take away from this in terms of their brains? Should we? What do you want to say about to help people have the best brain they can have?
don't get stultified in one thing. Just engage in a whole bunch of different activities throughout your life. Don't get in a rut.
Okay, so be curious.
Be curious, yeah. Be curious. Learn new stuff.
Learn new stuff all the time.
All the time.
And that's what this show is about, pretty much,
Yes.
because we love to have people like you come on and help us learn new stuff and teach me, because obviously I had a few misconceptions about how these things work. And I just want to thank you for coming on.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
It was great fun, both before and during the show. So I just also, of course, always want to thank the crew. They're terrific, and they show up all the time, and the people in the control room. And thanks to viewers for watching.